This is Module 2, Verbs and Formality. The first thing I want to address when talking about verbs is the active and passive voice. The most natural way to write and speak is to use the active voice, which in English has the structure subject, verb, object. The passive voice, which is essentially the active voice inverted, so object, verb in the passive voice, and then maybe a subject at the end. The passive voice can be used to serve particular purposes. Because this voice is harder to understand, because it takes people longer to process it, it should only be used when you have a reason for doing it, never as a default. Here are some reasons to write in the passive voice. First of all, I have no idea what the subject is, and there's no way to find out. Or, the subject is so unimportant that it's not even worth mentioning. Or, the emphasis is on the action, not on the person doing it. But be careful here. You have to make sure that if you leave out the person doing the action, the reader won't be confused. As we go through these modules, I will point out other reasons you might have for choosing passive voice. Now, when you do choose the passive voice, you should be aware that it can be used to avoid taking responsibility. For example, the sentence, mistakes were made, commonly used by politicians to avoid taking responsibility. Who made the mistakes? Not me, not you. A more specific example, cigarette ads were designed to appeal especially to children. Who would do such a thing? No one's pointing fingers. No one's taking responsibility. Be aware that the passive voice can also be used to avoid taking responsibility in an academic or scientific context, and you want to try to avoid that, especially avoid doing it unintentionally. So please use the passive voice with caution. Don't use it as your default. Now that we've talked about when to use the active and passive voice, let's look at what they both look like in 3 different tenses that you'll be using often, just as a little review. The past tense, the active voice, we found 3 instances of X. The passive voice, 3 instances of X were found. Now the present tense, the active voice, we find 3 instances of X every time we look. And now the present tense, the passive voice. 3 instances of X are found every time we look. Finally, the present perfect, the active voice. We've found 3 instances of X. If you're writing, you'll often write this out as we have found. 3 instances of X have been found. That would be the passive voice. Now, let's move on to talk about the purpose of verbs in a sentence. The main thing that verbs do in a sentence is they help you get to the end of the sentence. Verbs drive sentences along while nouns slow them down. Because verbs are the things that pull the readers through the sentence, we want to use them as much as possible, and especially we want to use precise, active verbs. Whenever we see nouns that should be verbs, we want to change them back. We want to use verbs in the positive form as much as possible, and we want to keep the subject and verb as close together as possible. I'll go into each one of these in more detail. First, use precise active verbs. This is what precise active verbs look like. Precise active verbs are not verbs like make, do, have, or is, or any of the being verbs, which are any form of the verb to be, and any words like seem, appear, or become. These verbs are signs that your actual verb is hiding as a noun. One of the most important things to think about when choosing a verb is whether or not it is a collocation with the words around it. This means ask yourself, does the verb belong with the nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions that it is working together with? Is it commonly found together with these words? If you don't know collocations very well, try using a dictionary like the Oxford Collocations Dictionary, available online at osdic.com. In fact, maybe you should pause this video just now for a moment and go there and look up a word, an everyday word like research or help, to get an idea of what collocations are. This resource is one of the most useful resources for writers in the sciences, especially when English is not your native language. Now, let's move on. Here's an example of how precise active verbs can be used in sentences to explain research. Here, I've underlined the verbs for you so that you can easily see how many verbs are being used. 4 sets of genes work in concert to start the circadian clock. It's a feedback loop. Clock and BMAL1 proteins form a complex that binds to the period and cryptochrome genes, switching them on and initiating gene expression. The proteins produced by the second set of genes then suppress clock and BMAL1, which in turn represses their own expression. When period and cryptochrome proteins are eventually degraded, the clock can restart. The next thing we'll talk about is how sometimes a verb is hidden in a noun. This is called a nominalization. For example, when you see the phrase do an analysis, what you really mean is analyze. That's 3 words, that verb do, which tells us nothing, and the noun analysis, which actually tells us the action that's happening. All of that can be condensed to one precise verb, analyze. In the same way, show emphasis can be changed to emphasize. Show an expansion can be changed to expand. Show a fluctuation can be changed to fluctuate. Is applicable to can be changed to applies to. Give consideration to can be changed to consider. And finally, something like make payment can be changed to pay. When you change nominalizations back to verbs, not only does your writing become more concise, but it also becomes more reader-friendly, as more verbs will help your reader stay engaged. Helen Sword, who's the author of Stylish Academic Writing, has made an excellent 5-minute video in collaboration with TED-Ed about just this, nominalizations, which she calls zombie nouns. I recommend you take 5 minutes to search for zombie nouns on YouTube and experience this video. It's the one with the skeletons. For now, let's practice changing nouns back into verbs. Here are some examples. For determination of the factors that play a role in. In this phrase, can you find the zombie noun? Can you find the nominalization and figure out how it needs to be a verb? That's right, the nominalization was determination. So you have to determine the factors that play a role in. How about this one? Participants had a strong willingness to help. The zombie noun here is willingness. You can say participants were willing or very willing to help. How about this one? This is in support of our conclusion. Where's the noun that should be a verb? Support should be a verb. This supports our conclusion. After evaporation of the solvent. Evaporation should be a verb. Here it's after the solvent evaporated. But wait, it could also be after the solvent evaporates. As a noun, we don't actually know what verb tense we're in. So changing it into the verb in this situation also gives us more information than we otherwise would have had. Next example. Knowledge about the regulatory network implicated in plant polysaccharide degradation by fungi is limited. The zombie noun in this sentence is knowledge. It should be a verb, know. But who knows what? In this case, the subject is the understood we. We know. How much? Knowledge is limited. We know little about the regulatory network implicated in plant polysaccharide degradation. Final example. The transport of sugar monomers by several yeasts occurs by facilitated diffusion. In this sentence, the verb is occurs, but the actual verb, the verb with very specific meaning, is hiding as a noun. Can you find it? The verb should be transport. What transports what? Several yeasts transport sugar monomers by facilitated diffusion. Now that you've had some practice changing zombie nouns back into verbs, let's talk about keeping verbs in their positive form. Now, this doesn't mean that the meaning of the verb should be positive. It means that we should avoid using not and instead choose a more specific word. So, did not remember becomes forgot. Did not comply with becomes violated. Did not succeed becomes failed. Not important becomes unimportant. Does not have becomes lacks. Notice how this way of writing is more concise. But you should actually use it for another reason. It's much friendlier to the reader. It's harder for us to process something that is not than it is for us to process something that is. We usually cannot easily see the lack of something. We can more easily see something that is right in front of us. I can compare, for example, going from Europe to the US. When you first land in a US city, from almost any European city, you quite quickly notice how many homeless people are living on the streets compared to where you came from. But when you go the other direction, from the US to Europe, it usually takes a while to notice what's missing. You can also think about this concept at a more basic level when you look at children. Research done on children gives us insight into how our brains develop and function. When you give a very small child a negative command, for example, don't throw your food on the floor, you usually don't see the results you're looking for. But when you change the command to a positive one, when you tell them what they can do with the food, for example, food goes in your mouth or on your plate, then it's like magic. Suddenly they're doing what you've asked them to do. Why? It's a lot easier to understand if we're told what to do, or what happens or what should happen, than if we're told what not to do or what doesn't happen. Now let's move on to the next part, which is about keeping the subject and verb close together. Because the basic structure of an English sentence is subject, verb, object, readers expect to see the verb as soon as possible after the subject. Essentially, once readers read the subject, they are waiting for the verb. And that means that they'll pretty much just skim over everything else until they get to the verb. Which means two things. One, readers are ignoring the information you've placed between the subject and the verb. And two, the sentence feels heavy to the reader because they are having to work so hard to get to the verb. Here's an example of the subject and the verb being far apart. One study of 930 adults with multiple sclerosis receiving care in one of two managed care settings or in a fee-for-service setting found that only 2/3 of those needing to contact a neurologist for an MS-related problem in the prior 6 months had done so. Notice there's actually two sentences here. There's the subject one study and the verb found. And then after the word that, there's a subordinate sentence that starts with a new subject, 2/3 of people. And the verb is had done. So in both of the sentences, the main sentence and the subordinate sentence, the subject and the verb are as far apart as they can possibly be. To revise this sentence, you'll probably have to make two sentences, but both will be easier to read. Now, I'd like to talk briefly about formality and how the verbs you choose can help you change your level of formality. We can think of formality as a continuum, from less formal on the left side to more formal on the right. Now, English is a mixture of two language trees, the Germanic language tree and the Latin language tree. Words that come from the German side of English are considered to be less formal than words that come from the Latin side of English. Here are some examples. Germanic words like buy, row, list, ask, before, begin, start, and so on are less formal than their Latin equivalents: purchase, series, sequence, inquire, prior, commence, initiate, and so on. What else affects the formality of a sentence? Phrasal verbs are verbs that are composed of two or more words that make up the meaning of the verb. Single word verbs are verbs that only have a single word, of course, that give the entire meaning of the verb. Here are some examples. Go in, call off, back up, do away with, go ahead, and so on. Those are all phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs come to us from the German side of English. Single word verbs are verbs like enter, cancel, support, discard, start, or proceed. Single word verbs can come to us from either the Germanic side or the Latin side of English. What else affects the formality of your sentence? Whether or not you choose short words or long words affects the formality of your sentence. Whether or not you choose verbs or nouns. This is what we were just talking about with nominalizations. The first sentence has a nominalization. The implementation of the plan by the team was successful. The second sentence uses a verb. The team implemented the plan successfully. Choosing active voice or passive voice affects the formality of your sentence. And what kind of information goes in your subject position can also affect the formality. If your subject is human or concrete, it's less formal. If your subject is very abstract, if you use an abstract object there, it becomes a lot more formal. This does not mean that you should choose all of the more formal elements in order to write a grant application or to write about your research to publish in an academic journal. Academic journals, grant applications, and professional writing, they require a professional level of English, a professional level of writing. They do not require the most formal writing you could possibly create, because the more formal you get, the less readable you get. As a result, I'd like to make some recommendations on which elements of this continuum you should choose. Humans as subjects we'll talk about in more detail in the next module. Active voice, single word verbs, short words, using verbs instead of nouns, choosing words with Latin origin. You can combine things that are slightly more formal and things that are slightly less formal in order to create something that is readable and clear, but still has a professional level of formality. This does not mean that you will never use the passive voice, or that you will never use a Germanic origin word, or that you will never use a phrasal verb, or that you'll never use a long word in your text. You will, of course, use those. The key to creating a readable text is creating a balanced text and having a reason for the decisions that you make. Let me recap what we've talked about with verbs in this module. Use verbs in the active voice as much as possible. Keep the subject and verb close together. Make sure that your verbs are precise. Make sure that they belong in a collocation, and make sure that you put them in positive form whenever possible. On the whole, though, what should you remember about verbs? You should remember that verbs are what pull your reader through the sentence. They are what keep your reader going. They keep your reader reading your text. So you should use as many of them as possible, and you should remove as many zombie nouns as possible.